Our first topic for the afternoon is conflict or cooperation, the local consequences of raw materials production in a globalized world by Dr. Jessica Steinberg, Associate Professor, Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies, Indiana University, Bloomington. Jessica is also the director of the Ostrom Workshops program on environmental natural resource governance, and her research is the area of political economy with substantive interest in environmental politics, governance, and state capacity, violent conflict, technology, and of the state and common property institutions. Dr. Steinberg's recent book, Minds, Communities, and States, The Local Politics of Natural Resource Extraction in Africa, Cambridge University Press, 2019, Sprout Award winner 2020, explores variation in protest, repression, and non-state goods provision in regions of natural resource extraction. Our work has been published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of the Theoretical Politics, Political Geography, Perspectives on Politics, and Environmental Letters. She has conducted fieldwork in Senegal, Zambia, Mozambique, Congo, Brazza, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Please join me in welcoming Jessica. Jessica, please take over.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction, Raj. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm really excited to talk with you about some things that I've been thinking about and the ways we might go about sort of communicating them to students and broader communities. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully everybody can see this. And everybody can hear me, yes?
Yes, we can see you, and we can see the screen and hear you too.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So thanks again. And as Raj said, right, the conversation today is going to be about conflict or cooperation, the local consequences of raw materials production in a globalized world. And here's just a brief outline, so you have an idea as to where we're going to go. And in general, we'll be asking the question, what are the sort of localized consequences of raw materials extraction? And we'll talk about why that matters for the sort of global community. We'll then sort of briefly go over the fact that raw/natural materials are sort of an integral part of the supply chain with localized consequences and why we should care about that. That may seem relatively intuitive and obvious, but important to mention anyway. Then we'll talk a little bit about social conflict, repression, and mining in particular. And we'll sort of go through some empirical trends and ways of thinking and talking about that. And then we'll sort of shift gears a little bit and talk more about sort of community cooperation around natural resources and the possibilities there. And then finally, we'll try to tie it all together a bit. I would be happy to have any clarifying questions over the course of the next hour, if that's okay with you, Raj, but for maybe more substantive questions, maybe we can save those for the 20 minutes at the end. That would be great. Okay, so I'm sure at this point in the conference, you are all probably aware of the extent to which raw materials are really integral in our globalized economy, right? Interestingly, at this point, right, the one measure of how interdependent our trade networks are is that approximately about 80% of all trade flows are actually intra-industry or are sort of within a particular global network or supply chain. That means like our dominant form of trade is within a particular production network, so through the supply chain. Which is really important because it means these places where we extract natural resources are really connected in so many levels and so integrally to consumers and to other added value processes along the way. Supply chains generally begin at raw material extraction. That's usually in the form of materials or minerals, petroleum, timber, agricultural commodities. Those are the kinds we're going to think about, materials we're going to talk about today. And And one thing to sort of think about in terms of how much, frankly, stuff we're taking out of the earth at this point is sort of a helpful statistic, is that we are extracting 70% more in the way of natural resources from the earth than we were approximately 20 years ago. So that is a massive increase, and much of it is in the form of metals and minerals for, frankly, for greening technology, but also for our cell phones and our computers, et cetera. This graphic right here is useful. It's from resourcetrade.earth. It's part of the list of resources that I'll provide with this presentation, but it's produced by Chatham House, and they have some wonderful visualizations. So just as an example, again, you might be familiar with this, right? But we can think about sort of the extent of globalized supply of these raw materials for a single product, right? In the context of our cell phones, which some of you may be using to watch this, right? The raw materials for a single smartphone come from up to 18 countries, including Chile, China, Democratic Republic of Congo, Australia, Rwanda, India, and many, many more. And these include lithium, bauxite, tin, tantalum, copper. And in fact, your cell phone includes estimates of up to 70% of the total number of elements on the periodic table. So that means that we have this, we really have to have a global reach in order to make this single product, right? Which the components of which are then produced primarily in East Asia, assembled there primarily in China, packaged by materials from the US, Germany, and the UK, and then shipped after that to logistics and distribution hubs around the world, right? So you're all, again, probably not unfamiliar with this level of globalized production, but it is kind of helpful, I think, to sort of, think about what you're holding maybe in your hand, and how many different places the little component parts and materials for the production of those parts have come from. Okay, so now I'm going to, what I want to do is sort of focus on what are the sort of potential consequences for the people and communities living at the point of raw materials extraction. So in the actual locale where lithium or bauxite or tantalum or timber, right, is actually being extracted, what does that mean for the communities in those areas? And in some cases, we sort of had the opportunity for employment opportunities, especially when it comes to construction of a mine or a dam, for instance. It can change their cost of living by bringing in large by leading to sort of new communities that live there to support those industries. This is certainly the case in a place that I'll talk about in Tet, Mozambique, where the cost of living skyrocketed upon the beginning of the construction of coal mines there. You can also sort of see evidence of some potential cultural violations where sacred lands or sites are taken up and used by firms or other actors for the extraction of these materials. And our sort of most famous case in the US, I think, would be Standing Rock in North Dakota. Right. There's also the potential for increased inequality at the local level, as well as environmental externalities and degradation in the form of increased noise pollution, salinization of the soil, competition over water and land resources, right? And all of these sort of consequences of extraction can lead local communities to mobilize and protest in resistance against the extraction of these raw materials. And furthermore, that then can lead to government response by sort of national governments to sort of either quell or address those protests. And so what's really interesting about these places, these specific locales where these resources are extracted, is that they really sort of demonstrate a collision of local, national, and global actors in one actual physical space, and they're required sort of to interact in that space. Okay, just as a heads up, this picture is a picture of a community actually in Zambia who was anticipating the arrival of a new mine, a copper mine. And the sort of picture here, the sort of hand-drawn picture was a sort of picture of the sort of mining trucks in full expectation. They were actually quite excited about this mine that was coming. I just really liked that picture. Okay, so Now, why should we care about these communities at the point of raw material extraction, right? Again, some of this might be relatively straightforward, especially when you think of it from a normative perspective, right? There are sort of local, both human and environmental costs, potential benefits in some cases, right? But we can think of, potential water contamination, safety questions, all sorts of things that we as humans tend to care about. We can also think practically about this. This matters because, and I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, this matters because changes and disruptions in the production of raw materials at the local level has global consequences. In particular, can increase or can disrupt supply chains, as we've all seen in a variety of other contexts in the last year or two. But also it can change and affect the price of the finished product for consumers. And finally, this is kind of theoretically interesting because we see all sorts of different kinds of outcomes in these spaces. Sometimes we see this protest and violence, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we actually see companies doing sort of right by communities and governments supporting them. So we really do see kind of a range of different outcomes that makes this sort of interesting in addition to practically and normatively important. So really briefly, before we sort of zoom in and think a little bit about how this happens on the ground, I really just want to talk about why it matters, sort of from what the sort of consequences are of these local actions at the global level. Because I'll start actually from sort of lower down on the slide, which is that these sort of local events have large consequences, right? They can, as I mentioned, interrupt supply chains. They can significantly increase prices for consumers or for the raw material in and of itself, right? And furthermore, we actually, because, the difference between these local contexts that are part of a globalized supply chain and those that might not be and might just provide for a domestic market, there's sort of different forces at work. So for those that are integrated into the sort of globalized supply chain, whether it be a cell phone supply chain or computer or textile or oil, right? These large companies that do this extraction can behave in ways that diffuse downward into these local contexts, and therefore actually can, in some cases, improve potential outcomes. I'm gonna go through some examples moving forward, but there is the possibility for these transnational actors to have localized consequences through their sort of firm level behavior, their company level behavior. And it's also the case that sort of national standards matter, right? How companies behave in a country is sort of very much related to what that country, what their sort of rules and regulations are with respect to that industry. And so you can have different mining codes and environmental impact assessment requirements, but we know that those are different across countries. And being integrated into the global supply chain means both that those local outcomes and the national context in which they exist can become much more visible to the consumer audience. And also it can sort of force firms who have to operate in different contexts to try to standardize their approach. And sometimes that means acting in ways that are even better than what you would expect given the sort of local context, potentially a lack of rule of law, lack of enforcement, et cetera. Again, I'm going to unpack some of this as we move forward. I just kind of want to give an overview. So overall, what's kind of important about these sites being part of a global supply chain is that they are kind of subject to demands and dynamics of the global market in a variety of ways. Okay, so let's zoom in to thinking specifically about mining and when we see the sort of mobilization and protest around it. Because again, this has sort of potential consequences for the supply chain, and we also might care about it normatively and from a theoretical standpoint. And we're going to focus a little bit on Africa, in part because it's where I've spent most of my time, and so I have lots of resources to sort of think about this. It's also important to focus on because it has a significant portion of the world's raw materials. It's estimated that Africa has more than 30% of the world's known, excuse my typo there, reserves of non-renewable natural resources, up to 60% of the world's cobalt. Democratic Republic alone has up to 80% of the world's coltan, which is used in the sort of semiconductors in your cell phone. So that is a huge concentration of a major resource that is in one country on one continent. Furthermore, for those countries, it matters because foreign direct investment is a major driver of growth and economic development. And over 30% of that investment is in the extractive industry. And so that's another reason we might care about it, right? And so here, these sort of pictures that I've got up on the slide. Here is just a demonstration. This first bar graph is a demonstration of a sort of the rapid increase in the number of annual openings of new mines in Africa. So in the 70s, you see there's relatively few, but it's really skyrocketing as we get to the 2010s. So there really are a lot of these specifically localized sites around mines that are worth talking about. And this is kind of what they look like, this, especially for a very large one. You have lots of sort of earth that's been moved around, right? You have lots of heavy machinery. It can actually be a bit of an overwhelming place to be because the sort of scale of things can be quite impressive. And here we have a sort of just a map of where mines tend to be on the continent. And you can see that a lot of them are concentrated in the Democratic Republic of Congo here, but lots are also over on sort of Western Africa, and then of course down in South Africa as well. This is where we see a lot of these communities, and you'll see that they do tend to be focused in countries that tend to have lower income per capita. And so it tends to be the case that that these mines are sort of major sources of revenue for these governments who have very limited ways of extracting taxes and revenues to function. So natural resources are especially important source of revenue for governments, for poor governments, especially in Africa. Okay, so let's talk more about why this is kind of interesting and what I really mean by the fact that we see kind of different outcomes. And so we might want to understand why we see one as opposed to the other. So here we have what I call sort of a tale of two communities. This is the province of Tet in Mozambique, which is in Eastern Africa, and it's sort of an arm that kind of juts out of Mozambique here. And in 2008, some of the largest coal mines, sort of one of the largest coking coal deposits in the world was discovered in Tet. And so as a result, once that becomes known, large companies who have the technical capacity to build a mine and extract that coal, and coking coal is used primarily as to help harden steel, but in the making of steel, but in other uses as well. So many companies came to make sort of bids on different concessions. And these little blocks here are each a concession, which is essentially a piece of land carved up by the government that can then be leased out to a company where they can build a mine and extract resources. Okay, so some of the first arrivers, some of the first firms to get there were Brazil's Vale and Australia's Rio Tinto. Okay, and so they actually have, they got concessions right next to each other, really pretty close to each other, with really quite similar context, similar communities living in and around them for the most part. And this is kind of what they look like. And actually what's interesting is you can see just in this picture right here, a number drawn on that house. And essentially what happened is that Bali arrived, and these are large mining projects that actually often require large amounts of land. And so they often lead to large communities being resettled or relocated outside of the region of the mine's construction. And so in order to do that, they often label the houses so that they can keep track and make sure that that it's clear who is getting relocated where and how they should be compensated. So Bali sort of goes about this process of designing what's called an environmental impact assessment, as well as what's also called a resettlement action plan. These are sort of ways that the company plans on handling the environmental consequences and the community consequences of their mine. And Rio Tinto did the same thing, right? Because both of whom were going to build these large mines that required significant large parts of land. Now, what's especially interesting about this is, in spite of their similarity and proximity to each other, in the Vala context, in around 2012, we saw about 500 community members gather and protest and actually successfully interrupt essentially the railroad that carries coal from Tet, which is the province, to the coast, to the port of Beira, because they were frustrated with Vala's behavior, right? So we saw significant, and this cost the company like millions of dollars a day, right? This interruption and this action by the community, this protest, this mobilization. Similarly, though, what's interesting is that just, not more than a few kilometers away, and that's kind of the scale we're talking about here, maybe 15 kilometers from edge to edge. Similar situation, but there was no protest. The community was largely relatively content with the way that the mine was proceeding. And they had been compensated with housing and some other forms of sort of direct transfers, given that they were asked to move off their land in order to accommodate the mine. All right, so here we have these two concessions in two communities where there were sort of really different outcomes. And so the real question is sort of how do we arrive at these different outcomes? And this is not unique to Mozambique. This picture is a map that I put together where we have all of the red dots are mines around the continent. And all of the yellow dots are instances of social mobilization, some related to a mine, some not. And the sort of slightly darker dots are social mobilization instances where governments used force in response to these instances of social mobilization. And so the question is, okay, so is it the case that essentially mining just leads to large amounts of protest and social mobilization in general, right? And it turns out that actually the opening of a new mine, at least on the continent, on the African continent, makes protest and social mobilization, makes the likelihood of that occurring 100% greater relative to if there is no mine there. All right, so we do know, for instance, that the presence of a mine makes social conflict more likely. That's a pretty big kind of finding, an important consequence. Interestingly, many of you may be familiar with the concept of blood diamonds or sort of armed conflict around natural resources in mining. We don't actually see that on a systematic scale when new mines open. And I'm happy to talk more about that at a later point. The other thing that's especially interesting and frankly worrisome is that these protests are much more likely to be repressed by a government if they're close to a mine. So if we think that people protest and march about a variety of different kinds of grievances they might have, if it happens near a mine, governments are much more likely to use violence in response, right? So here we have a scenario where just the presence of a large extractive project leads to a greater likelihood of conflict at the community level. And also it makes governments more likely to be violent, right? So that is a problem for us. So let's try to think about how and why that might happen. And we might, for instance, think that that's, some natural resources some kinds of raw materials are more likely to lead to conflict than others, right? And so this first graph here helps us think about whether that's the case. And it turns out that even though that the sort of percentage of mines that are, for instance, coal on the continent, right, it is no more likely to have conflict if it is coal than if it is copper. In other words, it does not appear to be the case that the specific resource makes conflict more likely, right? Which is kind of helpful to know, especially because we have these strong narratives in the media, right? That oil and diamonds and gold, right, tend to lead to lots of conflict. It doesn't seem to vary significantly with the type of resource. It's also the case that we might think, and a very common discussion in the media, is that these firms are held by different foreign actors. So there's lots of mining investment in Africa by Australia. So Rio Tinto, as I mentioned, is an Australian firm. There's also Canadian investment, Chinese investment, right? These are the sort of major forms of investment in mining in Africa. And we might think in the common narrative is that, frankly, mines that are held by the Chinese are more likely to lead to conflict than others. And this is often has been argued because for a variety of relatively unfounded reasons, frankly. But it turns out that actually doesn't turn out to be significantly true. Slightly more, but not by a significant amount. So it turns out that the owner of the mine, where the capital comes from, doesn't actually matter that much either. All right. And when we think about sort of violence around mine on the part of government, so given that there's a protest or social mobilization around these mine, we are some governments more likely to use force than others? And this is interesting because it turns out there are some governments that tend to be more repressive than others. So Central African Republic is definitely one of them. Interestingly, Ghana is one of them, which is surprising to us because we tend to think of it, because we tend to think of democratic countries as being less repressive, using violence less. But around mines, that doesn't seem to matter as much. So here we are, we've got these sort of empirical regularities where mines lead to conflict or lead to sort of social protests, right? That doesn't correspond with the natural resource that's being extracted or the country of the company comes from. So whether it's Australians doing it or Chinese doing it. And that protests that occur near a mine tend to engender more violence. And we know in general, countries that have a lot of mining tend to be more repressive. Governments tend to use violence more for a variety of reasons. But this is especially interesting because even in this context, there's very little difference, actually, it turns out, at least in this time period, between democracies and non-democratic countries. Okay, so how does this actually happen on the ground? If we think that as a goal, we might want to either at least understand, but potentially avoid conflict when we can, especially if it leads to violent responses on the part of the government, let's try to understand what might be going on there. And here we really have to think about the way in which globalization compels the collision of local, national, and global actors in this sort of defined natural resource space, right? So we have the firm who benefits from natural resource extraction, right? These companies, right? Their goal is to extract resources and export and sell them, right? But they also, and they have difficulty leaving, in part because they've invested a lot of money and there's only so many places these resources can be found, okay? And they often require what's called a social license to operate. So they're aware that they need essentially community support in order to continue to operate. And so they make promises in the form of sort of often corporate social responsibility, or even promises related to contractual obligations that are actually required to be implemented and carried out to local communities in order to secure this social license to operate. The local community, for their part, live and work near extraction. And of course, they're heterogeneous, a wide range of sort of interests and income levels, et cetera, right? And they are often the people that experience environmental effects, right? And they are the ones that have the capacity to potentially provide a social license to operate, right? But they tend to be the most immediately affected by these extractive operations. Governments benefit from extraction because they receive royalties and taxes, and they can also invest in local development. And these benefits are especially important in poor countries where there's limited alternative sources of revenue. So we do see countries where the revenue that governments get from a natural resource is on the order of 200 to 300% more than they get from, for instance, tax revenues. Okay, they do, however, also potentially rely on political support from communities in the area. Right, and this actually matters. Even if we think the government is non-democratic, right, they still can on occasion rely on political support because even authoritarian governments are toppled from the bottom up, right? And then the final thing to keep in mind about the sort of role of government in these spaces is that we're really talking about a couple of different levels. We're talking about the local government, who, in at least many of the African contexts, tend to generally have limited power. This is less true in Latin America, where there's a little bit more formal decentralization of power and fiscal capacity to local governments, versus the sort of national government who sort of sets regulations and enforces the rule of law in these contexts. Right. And there's also the role of international institutions. We're not going to talk so much about that, but they tend to set some global standards as it pertains to sort of the environmental conduct of firms, right, and how they should treat communities that they have to relocate. In some cases, they can actually play an enforcement role, but that's only really contingent on whether the company relies on them for some loan rule. Okay, so here's just a walkthrough of what this looks like on the ground. Companies tend to make promises to communities that they either follow through on or they don't, right? And communities, if they don't follow through, communities kind of have to decide whether they're going to mobilize or not, right? And the government, if they mobilize, the government has to decide for its part whether it's going to support the community, right? Which might be costly because that might mean they lose out on revenue from the resource, or they might repress the community in the interest of protecting the mine. Okay, so in the context of our Mozambique case, in one case, we actually saw the community follow through, or the firm follow through with its promises of relocating the community and providing adequate compensation. Whereas in Bali's case, they did not follow through. There was a protest, and the government actually sided with the local community. And this is important because I think these are most of the stories that we hear, right, where violence emerges. All right. So what we care about is why and under what conditions do we actually get this protest outcome? And it turns out there's some things that matter, in particular, whether communities can impose costs on the company through, for instance, in the Mozambique case, actually stopping the extraction or production of the mineral. Some interesting things that happen are that it turns out that if the mine is built on an area that actually has better land for crop use and farming, you actually see more protests because it's more expensive to get that land from communities. And so companies are often not willing to pay the relevant amount for this good land. And so communities get more frustrated about that. Finally, we might also wonder when governments actually decide to use violence. We know on average that protests near mines make governments more violent, but that is especially true if it's a very valuable mine that the government can't afford to sort of lose out on revenue from. And finally, if that community is especially important for government support, then they're less likely to use repression. So actually, in this case, the protest corresponded with a set of elections, and the government actually really wanted to retain the support of this community in the context of that election. And we think that might be why they decided to side with the community. Okay. So how do we avoid these sort of mobilization or these sort of protests and conflict at this area in these contexts? So we have a couple of different policy tools at our disposal. And again, I'm happy to talk more about these. They generally work sort of conditionally, right, under some contexts. So first, there's these sort of transparency initiatives, publish what you pay. One very sort of well developed is called Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. And essentially this forces firms and governments to publish the amount of money that companies are paying to the companies are paying to governments to be able to extract those resources, with the idea that we want to make sure that they are not overpaying governments, that governments are not squirreling away these resources, right? And so the idea here is if we can expose these monetary transfers, then we might be able to undermine the sort of extent to which firms retain any power over governments in these contexts. But of course, the effectiveness of these is really contingent on the sort of awareness that EITI exists, and the extent to which the publicity mechanisms where people can actually observe whether, for instance, a firm is bribing a government or not, who can actually see that, right? And so we'd want to know whether communities actually have access to that. And we do see that under some contexts that actually works, right? It works to lead firms to actually behave better in these local contexts, and communities to benefit more from these extractive resources. We also have this option that's called community development agreements, and these are contracts between communities and companies in these local spaces that are meant to empower communities and convey to them what they are in fact entitled to, right? So that these environmental consequences might be mitigated, that they might get certain employment opportunities, right? But but the effectiveness of those mechanisms is entirely contingent on the capacity to enforce them, right? And so you really need a third party like a local government to be able to enforce them. And so if those are weak, you may not be likely to actually see the effectiveness of these kinds of agreements, right? Similarly, pretty much for the same reason, national regulatory frameworks, right, ensuring that these companies treat communities well matter, but you sort of need enforcement capacity. And in many of these countries, especially the countries that rely on natural resources for large amounts of revenue, right, they have less bureaucratic capacity. They have less sort of capability to enforce contracts, right? And so the very same countries that we are talking about are the ones that are going to be generally less likely to be able to implement these kinds of protections for communities. And we also see some policy tools such as sort of private codes of conduct. So some companies actually develop internal or in partnership codes of conduct that are meant to govern their behavior on the ground. So they and they often dovetail with global schemes like the Global Governance Compact on mining, where firms make promises about how they're going to behave on the ground, right? And publish these commitments as a way of demonstrating their commitment to the well-being of communities in the areas that they work. Okay, now I've gone through all these and I'm happy to provide a little bit more detail, right? I sort of gave this as a brief overview. But one of the problems, we don't actually have a good sense of how well these tools work to make sure that communities that are in regions of raw material extraction either benefit from it or at least are not excessively harmed, in part because we don't have a very good handle on the sort of wide-ranging sort of list of cases. And so we expect that some of these things work under some conditions. We don't actually have a very good sense of when. And I will say I focused on Africa up until this point, but Africa is one of several large suppliers of these kinds of natural resources to be integrated into to supply chain. So in Latin America, which is one of the sort of largest producers of copper as well as pig iron, we see lots of sort of social conflict around mines there as well. And here's just even within Peru, right? So we see This is a really a global phenomenon, even beyond Africa. And so this is, this remains important. It remains something we sort of continue to think about in terms of, how widespread is sort of conflict, sort of social conflict related to mining, because the mines themselves are not benefiting local communities, and sort of what can we do to think about it, right? I'm not going to go through this slide because it's a little bit dense, but I just wanted to provide it for reference, because it provides some interesting results and sort of variation based on different regions, right? We don't get the same outcomes globally, and so it'd be helpful to know how different regions differ. So I'm gonna sort of peruse over this slide, but it's here for reference. Okay, so that was sort of like a whirlwind tour of thinking about social conflict and mobilization around mining, with the idea that that's sort of indicative of the failure of these extractive sites to provide any sort of local benefit to communities, or to not at least harm them, right? And so where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us thinking about the fact that globalization really, as I mentioned, sort of compels the collision of local, national, global actors in a single defined space, right? So we really need to think, who are the actors involved here? What are the potential ways in which they can be constrained, and how are they interacting together, right? I've also suggested that environmental and social consequences, as well as sort of like unmet expectations, can lead to this sort of mobilization. And that mobilization is really, this sort of protest is really costly for all involved, for companies who lose out on revenue from the resource that gets interrupted, consumers, right, because firms pass that price on to them, governments, who rely on that revenue as well, but also may rely on political support from communities, and communities probably first and foremost, because they endure both the social and environmental consequences of extraction, but also the cost of sort of mobilizing and protesting, especially when it involves violence in response by the government, right? Which is, as I sort of mentioned, more likely if the government has a really large stake in that extractive site. So conflict over what we can think of as the distribution of costs and benefits from natural resource extraction or raw materials extraction is widespread. And so the question is then, like, is there an alternative way that this can go? All right, so now I'm going to move on. I know we're already at 1:48, 1:45. If I can take till 2:05, is that okay, Raj?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to move on because I don't want to leave you with the idea that we're sort of doomed, as it were. So I want to talk a little bit about, is there a better, more equitable way to extract these resources, right? And what would local cooperation for social and environmental benefit look like? All right. And that leads me to talk about Lynn Ostrom. Some of you may have heard of her. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for the following finding. She suggested that actually communities can come up with sort of local cooperative arrangements, and I'll talk about what that looks like in just a second, to manage a natural resource equitably and environmentally well. In other words, they are able to come together and work together in particular ways, in particular resource contexts, to ensure the long-term viability of that resource and to benefit from its use and extraction. So what does that look like from a Lynn Ostrom perspective? And so that looks like the extent to which the people that use the natural resource, right, are those that actually design the rules around its extraction and distribution and use. So they decide when how much of that resource can be taken out of the ground, or in many cases cut down if it's timber, right? The community would decide what the rules are for that, what the punishment is for violating that, how to monitor people's use of that resource, right? And then they also sort of enforce those rules. All right, so the general idea here is that Lynn Ostrom suggested, look, we are actually innovative and cooperative in particular contexts. And conflict and overexploitation need not be the main outcome, right? Because when the user groups themselves, the communities that are actually using the resource, design rules and institutions for their use, we can get better outcomes. Now, this is not obvious because many of you may have heard of the tragedy of the commons, right? Which I'm going to talk about in just, well, maybe I'll do that first, right? Because up until Lynn Ostrom, the general narrative had been for certain kinds of resources, communities are essentially incentivized to consume, or individuals are incentivized to consume, even if collectively we would like to preserve something, right? And when I say this is for particular kinds of resources, we're really talking about something called common pool resources, those that are difficult to keep people from using. So we can think about like a large forest where it would be difficult to keep people from using it, or a water supply or fishery, right? But are in fact subtractable. We can run out of them. We can deplete them, right? We can overexploit them. And these kinds of resources present this particular kind of problem where the benefits of consumption, of use of that resource are concentrated, but the costs of it are sort of diffuse over the large community and over time. And so you end up with what Jared Diamond describes as the sort of, in his case, the entire collapse of a particular group or society because of their overexploitation. In his favorite example that many of you may have heard of is the sort of Easter Island example, where you see this rapid population increase and then it drop off excessively. And his argument is that's because of the overexploitation of trees on the island. Now, as a side note, it turns out that's not actually accurate in terms of what happened. It turns out that that new visitors to the island brought with them very large rats who promptly ate all the trees. And that's actually more likely what happened. It turns out the humans ate the rats and were actually quite ingenious in surviving. But neither here nor there. It's an interesting story and sort of often used to illustrate this problem, whereby the assumption is that humans will overexploit when they can, right? And so this is what the dominant narrative was until Lynn Ostrom came around and said, look, it need not be the case that we have some strong government intervene, or it may not need be the case that we have some firm or private actor manage it. We as humans, as a community, can, in many cases, successfully manage our resources for the long run and for the social benefit of our community. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what this might look like in a particular industry. Right, so I'm going to talk briefly about the timber industry, which is notably smaller than the sort of minerals and metals industry that I was discussing in the first portion of this presentation. And this is just one representation of the sort of global forestry product trade that primarily is different forms of sawn wood and raw logs. And you'll see there's a fair amount in North America, and a fair amount in China. I would expect there's actually a lot more than is on this map, but either way, the value of it is likely smaller than the metals and minerals. It's definitely smaller than the metals and minerals industry that we've been talking about. Okay. Okay, so what would this kind of Ostromian management of local resources look like that might lead us to avoid some of the kinds of outcomes we saw in the first half of this? Well, it turns out that community forestry, so essentially what that means is the people that live in and around this resource, a forest, right? They have the capacity to design rules for how much to cut down, when they can do that, how frequently, who can do that, right? And who might be violating that, right? And so those rules are really based on their own local knowledge, their local investment in that forest surviving for the long run, right? Which then leads them to want to sort of continue to monitor and enforce the use of that forest and make sure that it is not over extracted or over depleted. Okay. And this is actually at work. We do see community forests in a wide range of places in the US, actually, as well as in parts of Cameroon and Congo Brazza and Senegal, and actually and all over the world. It turns out over 1 billion people likely rely in some way or another on a community or commonly held forest, right? And so it's still a small percent of the world's forests. We're talking at only up to 18% of global forests are actually held and managed in this way. The rest tend to be either publicly held by governments, right, or managed a little like the mining concessions that we talked about through timber concessions where firms hold them, right? And so the real question that we want to know is, what is the benefit of managing a resource this way, where communities themselves design the rules and implement and enforce them for the use of these resources? Well, it turns out we do have some data on this. We have some findings that suggest that when communities get to design these rights and manage the resource, it tends to reduce community inequality through by generating and redistributing income through the consumption and sale of charcoal or other forest products. I'm going to focus on the forest industry for the moment. It can, in many cases, improve environmental outcomes. So in the case of forests, we create larger carbon sinks that absorb some of the CO2 that we continue to produce. And also the possibility for payment for environmental services. In other words, there are mechanisms that allow for people to essentially pay communities to further support and cultivate and manage these forests in sustainable ways. It also tends to lead to, in general, the long-term viability of the resource. And this was really Lynn Ostrom's primary finding, is that when communities do this successfully, the population of trees or lobsters or fish tends to be healthier for longer. And some research that I'm working on right now suggests that we also see communities being more, developing more trust when they do this. Trust in in each other and in sort of even people outside of their community when they participate in these kinds of community management of resources. Okay, now, can we use that to think about the mining context? And the problem is that these are really different resource contexts that we need to sort of think critically about why we may be less likely to see community management of mining than of forests. So let's just sort of usefully compare the kinds of raw materials that we're talking about here, right? So in the first half of the presentation, we were really talking about what might be called sort of point or concentratedly in their location non-renewable resources, right? We talked a lot about sort of this sort of minerals and metals area, but also coal, right? Whereas in the second half, we're talking a little bit more about sort of renewable, more diffuse resources like timber, agricultural commodities, or fisheries, right? So in the first context, you generally have a little bit of limited sort of immediate livelihood benefit by communities, right? So it's not the case that the communities in and around the coal mine in Mozambique can really survive or use that coal for their livelihood, right? That's less common for something like tantalum and copper and gold than it is, for instance, trees and fisheries and agricultural commodities, right? So that sort of creates buy-in by communities for the management of that resource, right? It's also the case that those resources in the first half tend to be sort of subsurface resources, and so they're not easy to find and they're expensive to get out of the ground. Whereas timber and fisheries, right, they tend to require less in the way of technical and capital requirements, and they tend to be observable on the surface. And so actually that probably means that people have longer histories of developing institutions for managing sustainably these resources. Okay. And finally, right, we sort of, in terms of thinking about the potential environmental benefits, we talked primarily about environmental costs in the first half, but we can think about renewable resources having very clear potential ecological benefits, like creating carbon sinks, right, producing oxygen, right, etc. For the mining example, right, minerals in and of themselves generally tend to be pretty dirty to extract. the environmental benefits potentially come in the long run to the extent to which we use them as inputs for greener technology. And so the sort of the sort of environmental benefits tend to be more diffuse. So all of these things sort of create a different kind of resource context that makes timber and the sort of resources that are in the right column a little bit more likely to be sustainably managed through community management than the sort of mining non-renewable resources. However, that being said, it is the case that timber is extracted through foreign held concessions and overlaps with sort of local community rights in the same way that mining does, in spite of its sort of lower capital requirements and the possibility of actually being sustainably managed. And so the question is, okay, so is there something we can learn about this to sort of bring the sort of community management, right? Is there some role for that in the sort of supply of these resources in the global economy, right? And we're sort of faced with some challenges. There's room for creative thinking here, but at the moment we're really sort of challenged with the fact that communities may not really have access or capacity to be integrated into the global supply chain without these large actors. There are some instances in which we're seeing sort of cooperatives to do this, both for something like agricultural commodities, but also for mining. But these resources that require significantly large capacity and capital requirements are more difficult to do at the community scale, right? And so as a consequence, we face this barrier, right? Of ideally, we might use this sort of institutional tool of sort of community management of these resources, given that we tend to see better outcomes, right? There are major obstacles to integrating that kind of management into the global supply chain. All right, so if I'm going to sort of summarize what's sort of a slightly disjuncted but sort of opportunity to give you an overview of different kinds of raw materials management on the ground and how they can sort of lead to different outcomes, right? What I want to sort of say is that local outcomes at raw materials sites are often the result of local, national, and global actors and forces, but that in part depends on their degree or level of integration into the global supply chain, right? So as we saw, the timber industry is smaller at the global level, but there's a lot more going on at the local level. Characteristics of the resource and its context shape their management, and therefore the likelihood of environmental and social benefits. And I sort of got to that at the end. Conflict can emerge over the distribution of costs and benefits of extraction, which may be more easily avoided when ownership and management rights are really held by community user groups. Okay, so I have a long list of resources here that I think, this was a huge overview of a bunch of different things going on in terms of how we are thinking about sort of the production of these raw materials and their local consequences, right? But most of the things in this list are sort of helpful visualizations, data sources, some videos, and some organizational resources, and some cases that are helpful in sort of conveying, communicating, and teaching the ways in which actors interact on the ground in these spaces where our raw materials come from. Okay, thank you very much for, again, what was sort of a whirlwind overview of the sort of local consequences of raw materials extractions. I'm looking forward to your questions and also happy to respond via email after the conference if you would like to discuss further or ask for any resources. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, and we will go from there.
Okay, first of all, Jessica, thank you for a very, very good illustrated presentation. And like you said, it's about 5 minutes after 2. We are going to open up the remaining 15 minutes for a Q&A. So please, either you can ask your question or you can type your question in the chat box. And Jessica will try to respond to as many questions as possible between now and 2:15. Okay? Thank you. Go ahead, 2:20, I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Questions. Before you move into questions, I want to share something very quickly. For those of you who are joining to us for the 2 afternoon sessions, this program is jointly sponsored by the Center for International Business Education and Research and also the Center for Global Studies at the Indiana University Bloomington campus, and also by Reinhardt University and the International Studies Consortium of Georgia. We want to definitely express our deep sense of gratitude to both the NRCs for their support, for providing us with necessary resources to organize and conduct this program. Thank you. Please come back to your questions, please.
Jessica, I hope everybody's listening. All right. You succeeded in giving a whole bunch of examples from Africa, and in terms of community-based exploitation of mineral resources. Is it possible for you to cite any example with United States? Because the environmental difference is perhaps I will address the fact that in the African scenario, I think what we've studied, for from time to time is that based on exploitation, and the environment and the local people are left holding the bag, the empty bag, because these minerals are taken away and they are paid little or nothing. So can you compare that in terms of what obtains in the United States?
So yeah, so my understanding of your question is really to think comparatively, right? Like what is, how does that context differ from the US, and are there specific cases here? So your first question about sort of how things might differ, in general, and in this, I should preface this by, right, I sort of talked about the continent, right? There's quite significant variation, particularly in legal institutions and their framework and implementation across African countries, right? As there is, even as there is around the world. So, but on average, capacity for enforcement and access to legal institutions can tend to be less in a lot of the cases that I gave in the African context. So I spent a lot of time in Mozambique and Zambia and DRC, and the idea of sort of having access to a court to actually implement or enforce any of the contractual requirements or obligations by companies to communities was pretty limited, which is likely why you see a little bit more in the way of protest and conflict, right, than you might in the US. So that's one component, is sort of the enforcement component. The other component is about the sort of extent to which the behavior by firms may or may not be governed by something that is legally enforceable. So for instance, corporate social responsibility is a voluntary engagement by communities, often or by firms often on the ground. And so enforcing that is actually not really necessarily something that the legal institutions are responsible for. And so the extent to which something does or does not fall under those agreements, or within corporate social responsibility, as opposed to sort of some contractual requirement by the company, also determines this, right? So that matters for the which region we're talking about, right? Because because the kinds of corporate social responsibility we see in the US tend to be a little bit different. And so the kinds of things that we see in the US tend to be more likely to be contractually enforced, particularly when you have a strong legal system to do so. And we see that less in many of the sort of places and contexts where I've spent most of my time. So I think that answers some of your question, but I think there's a part or two of it that I might have missed. Is there anything else that
I think what you're saying is comparatively is very correct, and but the idea that a lot of these corporations will go to Africa, somewhere where there is less legal conformity or a system that will address these things, and take advantage and in a way to exploit and just loot the place and take these materials and pay the community little or nothing. And then beyond that, you're dealing with corrupt governments, that are ready to sell their people and pay them nothing. And all they resort to is suppression and oppression as far as local protests. I can give you some examples in terms of what these refineries, I would say oil companies are doing in somewhere in Nigeria. And there's a lot of environmental destructions. It's not because the government is not there, but it's because the government is not perhaps very responsive to the needs, and aspirations of the people. And this is a continuous conflict or source of conflict. And then you have social mobilization, like you say, coming out with protests, most of the time destructive protests. And I don't know what, for example, governments of these multinationals are doing about this, rather than saying, well, look, we don't want you to go out there and exploit people. And besides, we have to sanction the government one way or the other in a way for them to see the light of day as far as supporting their people.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I think the only thing that I would add is that well, maybe two things that I would add is that the extractive industry transparency initiative is meant to get to your first part of your question. Can we expose the extent to which firms are sort of, ensuring that governments don't intervene too much, right? And we would maybe do that by being clear about what the sort of nature of monetary transfer is between these two entities, right? Is really the big part there. And I'm also, I'm familiar quite a bit with the Nigerian example that you mentioned, right? And so, and yeah, there's a wide range. We do occasionally see good outcomes though. And so the one question is, how do we think about this? I will say there's one example just before moving on. I think France, just not more than 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, passed the very first law globally that said that companies headquartered in France are responsible for ESG, environmental, social governance violations at every point of their supply chain, whether it's in France or not. This is the first time they've really tried to extend that kind of power and enforcement for a private actor that operates transnationally, right? And so we'll see if or how that's going to go. But it's one of the first times that I think it is the first time that we've really seen this attempt to do exactly what you're saying, right? Which
yeah, exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for 2 brief questions and 2 answers. Our next session is at 2:40, so we want to give a 15-minute break at least. So please go ahead with the questions. You might also want to take a minute or 2 to record your impressions, general and specific, with regard to the professional impact of the nature of this presentation, and also what, if any, 1 or 2 ideas that you might be able to use in the classroom. But we still have time for 2 brief questions and answers.
I'll pose a question.
Oh,
Yeah,
hey,
please.
Hey, so this is a teaching related question, and I'm wondering how do you get your students to interrogate these ideas in the classroom? And I know that's a really broad question, but maybe there's a specific project you have them do to really dive into these very nuanced ideas or something. Do you have some creative ideas for getting students to think about these ideas?
Yes, actually. So I've taught versions of this, right, where specifically like sort of understanding the local context, what is actually going on, who the actors are, and what their interests are. And so one of the activities that I often do is I have the students read a collection of cases, and these are on the list of resources that are part of the presentation, but they include like the Normata Valley River Project, also a Colombian mining project for which there's a wonderful documentary that a colleague of ours here at the IU Law School made that really illustrates well these questions. So students read the cases and they actually watch that movie. And then in class, I assign them to a particular group. So they are either a company that extracts timber or whatever resource we're going to talk about. Or they're a member of a government, or they're a member of a local community, or maybe they're a member of international institution or a sort of a distant environmental NGO or something like that. And then their job is first to sort of sit together and define what they're interested in, what their priorities are, and then essentially to interact with each other and try to arrive at sort of an agreement on how and when and under what conditions this resource should be used and extracted and exported. And so I give specific scenarios of, this thing happened. What does each of these actors, what are they interested in? What tools do they have to get at that interest or to maximize that interest? And how effective are they likely to be given those tools? And so they tend to have a good time with that in terms of it allows them to really articulate the extent to which these actors really do have some overlapping interests and some not so overlapping, some sort of conflicting interests, and sort of think through what the implications are of that on the ground. So that's one activity that I've done a fair amount with these students. And then I'll also point to the Ostrom Workshop has a really wonderful website. In particular, we have a specific entire set of pages. If you go to it, that's just dedicated to teaching Ostrom. And so it's all the resources you could ever want or use for teaching different dimensions of sort of community or collective or local sort of cooperative management of natural resources and how we think about those institutions. So that's also a really wonderful resource that the workshop has put together.
I would also like to share with the group that just before the program began, Jessica sent me a list of multimedia resources page, and I will, when I send the evaluation feedback form to you, I will include it with that along with a few other things that have come to me already. We have time for one more question. Maybe since nobody's asking the question, I hope it's okay with you, Jessica, if I made a remark.
No problem.
Companies like Del Monte, which grow bananas in Central American countries, or what quote unquote banana republics, and sell it here, have three different challenges. One, they need to keep the prices low for the American consumer here so that they will buy the bananas. Two, they need to give the best return for their shareholders. Unfortunately, when you accomplish these two goals, Juan Valdez or somebody in Costa Rica is not going to be able to get a comparable wage, minimum wage, compared to what somebody is making in the United States. And in some ways, this is also true, especially in Nigeria and other African countries. And I have never visited Nigeria before, but Nigeria is an extremely oil-rich resource country in Africa. It should be one of the most wealthiest countries in Africa, not just for the country as a whole, but the individual citizens of the country. But unfortunately, the compromises made in terms of sharing the wealth between the oil companies in the United States and the government leaders or politicians in those countries is so significant that unless the individual citizen breaks open the pipeline somewhere and siphons off some unrefined gasoline, there is not a whole lot that he or she can get. And as a result, there is a very close connection between the compromise between the multinationals here in the United States and other countries like BP and so on and so forth, and the leaders in quote unquote developing countries, and which compromises ultimately, unless there are real ethical reasons to overcome, it's almost impossible to look at development in these countries of the level we have had in Western Europe or in the United States.
You know, I'm not sure I have a good response to that. I think that you're right. I think there is some change happening. We are seeing, you know, even so, pause on Nigeria for a second, but even recently, if we think about Texas, actually, and the extent to which environmental and social governance mechanisms are actually becoming a preference for large firms, right? I don't know if you saw, but the Texas government essentially said it would no longer do business with companies that had these requirements. And so the question is there, are we amidst the start of a sea change in this, where it could be the case that large corporations, and maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic than I should be, but that large corporations are going to start demanding, especially given the degree of transparency that is sort of starting to become commonplace about what it means to live in the Niger Delta, right? That could be an interesting sea change. We've seen norms change before. The question is, are they window dressing, or do they actually yield fundamental changes on the ground?
Well, we want to thank people like you who help to contribute to increase the awareness so that this kind of information can be shared with our students. I mean, this is a great movement forward as far as from an educational perspective is concerned. So yes, there is progress, there is much greater awareness, and especially after the arrival of the internet, there is a more quicker dissemination of information and challenges and so on and so forth. With that said, we are reaching the end of the time limit. On behalf of the group and on behalf of the two centers sponsoring the program and our consortium, I would like to thank you. And when you have a chance, please email us a PDF zip file of your PowerPoint presentation so that we could share this with the participant.